The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke.
Glory to you, O Lord.
At that time, Jesus told his disciples a parable. Can a blind man lead a blind man? Will they not both fall into a pit? A disciple is not above his teacher, but everyone, when he is fully trained, will be like his teacher. Why do you see the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, "Brother, let me take out the speck that is in your eye," when you yourself do not see the log that is in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take out the speck that is in your brother's eye. For no good tree bears bad fruit, nor again does a bad tree bear good fruit. For each tree is known by its own fruit. For figs are not gathered from thorn bushes, nor are grapes picked from a bramble bush. The good person out of the good treasure of his heart produces good, and the evil person out of his evil treasure produces evil. For out of the abundance of the heart, his mouth speaks. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
Sri Lanka, my dear friends, land that we all live, and perhaps most of us will die in this land, is called a multi-religious country. We have had a history of all the major religions living with each other and leading us as a nation, as people. But it is unfortunate as we look back that in spite of all the religions, and therefore all the religious leaders in this country, that we have now come both social and economic debacle as a nation. We do know that. But it's good to ask ourselves, stepping back, what went wrong? Of course, many things have gone wrong. One of those things that have gone wrong is obviously lack of leadership. Lack of leadership. And there are, when you talk about leaders and leadership, there is always the political leaders and the religious leaders. These are the two main streams of leadership that a country or a nation has. And today, the first reading taken from the book of Sirach, which was written about 200 years before the time of Jesus, that means about 2020 years ago. The author, who was a devout Jew and a man of wisdom, saw what was happening to his own people, his own country, his own land, the people of Israel. And what was the problem? Again, there were no good, authentic leaders. So then what happens when a nation has weak and corrupt leaders is that people also go along with them. That is why we have all these corrupt leaders, because we do not see through what's going on. So, author of the book of Sirach writes something very interesting. He instructs his people in his own language, of course, very subtle language and subtle instruction. He says how to see through a corrupt man, how to see a man who is not authentically spiritual. And then he brings in this beautiful expression. He says, when a sieve is shaken, the refuse appears. So a person's filth in his thoughts. The kiln tests the potter's vessels. Likewise, the test of a person is in his reasoning. The fruit discloses the cultivation of a tree. So the expression of a thought discloses the cultivation of a person's mind. So now you can see that the author of the book of Sirach tells his people, you are listening to all these leaders who are taking you for a ride. And so they do, they take you for a ride. And they are maybe political leaders, maybe religious leaders, and they say things that contradicts themselves. So he says, it's like a sieve. You shake it and the dust can be seen. So in a moment of crisis, in a moment of terrible disasters, and also in other times, the words of a man will tell you who that person is, what is inside. So therefore, my dear friends, like in our land, we have had political leaders who say whatever they say. And then we have thought, yes, they love our country, love our nation. And we also have so-called religious leaders representing many religions which are so profoundly meaningful. But these leaders or these men or women, they come out and say things which contradicts themselves and also contradicts with their own doctrine or their teaching or their religion. So then, Sirach says, listen to them, be careful of them. Now you can see that when you are a people, we all get carried away with the trends of the time. Someone says, okay, this one is a very spiritual man, or that one is truly a religious person. Sometimes the so-called religious are the worst people to deal with, and we have gone through it ourselves. So the instruction is, be careful of what they say. Listen to them, judge them, and know who they are. That's what Sirach was instructing his own people, because that was the only thing he could do. Because when a nation is going down the drain, when a country is falling apart, when people are part of it, what Sirach could do was to tell them, you are messing yourself up. Why? You don't see the dust. You don't see the emptiness of these people. So it is your problem. It's not the leader's problem. It is your problem. You don't see it. So how can your nation, how can your land be a land of prosperity and goodness? And that was Sirach's instruction to them. My dear friends, if you go to the history of the world, sometimes, unfortunately, religious leaders have been responsible for so much of destruction. Obviously, the Roman Catholic Church, if you read the history of the church, we have had popes who have taken people to war. We have had bishops and cardinals who have destroyed the name of the church. They appeared as so-called spiritual men, but totally empty and no reasoning. And that is why Book of Sirach, again, he says, do not praise a man before you hear him reason, for this is the test of people. So therefore, he goes on to say, see the reasoning behind. Now, my dear friends, recently I again was reading an article written by a noble Buddhist monk in this country. There are only very few of them. I feel so bad for them because there are so many rotten eggs that even they are seen as empty men today. Now what he says was, Father, what he wants to say is that if you say that you are a Buddhist, you can never talk about a race. Because Buddha, in his preaching, said, Buddhism does not belong to a race. It belongs to all people. So it is a contradiction of terms to say singular Buddhists, because being singular is belonging to a race. It can never be narrowed down to the doctrine of Buddhism. So therefore, my dear friends, see the reasoning behind whatever they said. Sirach was so correct in saying, if you don't see the reasoning of whatever they say, the logic in their preaching, the reasoning behind their thinking, you are not going to find authentic religiosity and authentic spirituality. And again, my dear friends, 200 or 300 years after the time of Sirach comes Jesus. And he sees the same problem with his nation, because when a country has no proper leaders, it destroys them for centuries. It is not something that happens overnight. It happens for a long time. So again, Jesus in the gospel today says, can a blind man lead a blind man? Will they not both fall into a pit? A disciple is not above his teacher, but everyone, when he is fully trained, will be like his teacher. So now, Jesus is referring to the political and religious leadership of his time. And he says, obviously, all of them are blind men and women. They don't know what they are talking about. They talk about Judaism, they talk about Moses, they talk about liberation, but they are themselves perpetrators of slavery, both religious and political. And that is what he was referring to. Can a blind man lead another blind man in the way that it should? They will both fall into a trap. They will both fall into the destruction that is due for them, that they are bound to fall into that. And therefore, my dear friends, Jesus' teaching is a little bit more or even more profound than that of Sirach, because Sirach was saying, be careful of what they say. See the reasoning, and then decide who they are. Now, Sirach was talking about religious leaders, and Jesus was talking about both religious and political leadership, because the Pharisees were both political and religious leaders, both combined. And the chief priests in the temple were also political figures, because they were all crashing each other's back. So that is why in the text today, Jesus tells them, be careful of what they say. Not only what they say, look for what they are doing. And that is why he says, why do you see the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? Because most of the time, all these religious leaders, political leaders, they point out the fault of the others. And not only them, all of us, we are so good at looking at what is wrong with the other, but they do not see what is wrong within oneself. So therefore, my dear friends, it also is influenced by the Greek thinking at that time. Now, if you study political science, Aristotle was one of those people who taught about democracy in the early stages of what democracy meant. So one of those things that Aristotle said was, do not only listen to your leaders. See what they do. Wait and see what they are doing, and then judge them. So Sirach had taken also from that Greek thought, and Jesus is also drawing from that thinking, the philosophical mind of his time. And he says, if you have blind leaders, and you are blind, and you are bound to head for disaster. My dear friends, in our own journey of life, not only political leaders, even we ourselves, we are so good at talking about what is wrong with the other, but you do not see what is wrong within yourself. A truly spiritual and authentically spiritual person is someone who sees one's own limitations, one's own darkness, one's own faults and weaknesses. And the more they find that within themselves, they will not be talking much. So therefore, my dear friends, it is important that before we talk about everyone else, let us learn to see my own darkness. That is why before we preach Christianity, it is important that we recognize within myself lack of Christianity within my own life, my own darkness, my own weaknesses, my own limitations. And the more I realize them, the more I will not be talking about others. My dear friends, in order to explain this, one of the greatest spiritual men that the church has ever produced is St. Francis of Assisi. He grew up and he became a monk at a time when the entire nation was corrupt in Italy. And it was Catholic, the religious leadership was disgustingly corrupt, and the political leadership was even more. And then he started his own congregation of monks at that time. So if you read the life story of St. Francis of Assisi, he says something very profound. What does he say? Do not preach. Do not preach. And he also went on to say, do not build any churches. Live your life. Live Christianity. What you do and what you live in your life is the best sermon that you can give to your people. So what did the monks do when Francis passed away? They built the biggest cathedral that you can ever see in Assisi. Why? Why? Because it is so easy for us to lose sense of the depth of what Christianity is all about. So therefore, my dear friends, we all have a duty to discern who good leaders are, both political and religious, including myself, my dear friends. I'm no exception. As we combine the message of the readings today, it is not our words, it is our life. That is the greatest sermon. And if my sermon is to be meaningful, it has to be first a sermon from within myself. Amen.